When you saw Michael say what he said last night, all these years later, what do you think?
It didn't bother me at all. He was telling his true feelings at that particular moment in time. And, you know, I know a lot of people are put off about it, and they allude to his relationship with Isiah Thomas or lack thereof. But I explain this to a lot of people. One has nothing to do with the other. Please understand that Michael Jordan is telling you how he felt about that particular moment at that particular time. It's not that he gives a damn about it now and he's losing any sleep over it now. It's about back then. And it's interesting that you have me on this segment with Jalen Rose, because I'd like to bring this up, and it's not to knock Jalen Rose, it's to support him. When Jalen Rose did that absolutely phenomenal documentary on the Fab Five and the University of Michigan, and he talked about how they felt about Grant Hill at that particular moment in time. When Jalen Rose was insulted, I came to his defense to everybody, including Grant Hill, because I said he was telling you what the feeling was about Grant Hill being at Duke at that particular moment in time. He's not talking about 20, 25 years later. He's talking about at that particular moment in time, he's giving you insight into the kind of thinking and the kind of mentality that had engulfed them as players competing against him. And I think that Michael Jordan was doing the same thing here. He's telling you at that particular moment in time, this is how we felt about Isiah Thomas and Bill Laimbeer and all of those guys. They didn't give a damn because the day before, Michael Jordan had, basically called them bad champions, bad for basketball, etc. And they were really put off and offended by Michael Jordan's words about them. Michael Jordan hated them at the time, admittedly so, and that was that.
I think he still hates them now. Jalen, what do you think?
I'm glad Stephen A. brought that up. Good morning, guys. And I want to teleport those that were alive at this time back to the late 80s and the early 90s. There were a couple of things in sports that were breaking glass ceilings. Number one, the argument about amateurism in the NCAA. And the Fab Five was first and foremost of that fight, taking on the baton for people who started before us, like John Thompson and UNLV and Syracuse and some of those great squads. The other thing that was at play was that NBA players were trying to figure out, in particular, if they were actually embracing being role models or not. Dennis Rodman was like one of the first athletes that became what was considered a rock star. He was like a Chuck Berry, like a Jimi Hendrix almost, an eclectic person, a lot of tattoos, a lot of piercings. Can tell that, he probably did a lot of drugs and did a lot of partying, but yet he was a champion, he was a very smart player, and he showed up when his team needed him the most. So what is a rival, okay? This is something that so many sports fans claim that they really want in the game, but they don't really know what they're asking for, Stephen A. And here's why. Because when you have a rival, that's a level of disdain that goes beyond the score of the game. See, right now, there's no physical intimidation in the game. You can drive to the basket. The first foul is a flagrant. The second time, you ejected from the game. When physical intimidation was a part of the game, that was a whole different level of dislike, because not only am I trying to beat you mentally, but I'm brutalizing you physically to the point where the first guy, Laimbeer, foul you, and then the second guy, Mahorn, to come and just knock you down. And Michael Jordan knew he had to get into the weight room. And this was his only rival. Our Detroit Pistons beat them 3 straight years in the playoffs. And Detroit area was on fire at the time. Michigan won the championship in '89. Desmond Howard had won the Heisman Trophy from the University of Michigan. We were winning championships in high school. And the Pistons were the first squad to have a plane for their team and to try to set up great accommodations. That was like a diss to the Bulls in a lot of ways, because their organization was looked at as one that didn't take care of its players. So finally, when that era ended with the owner, Mr. D, and Trader Jack, you had to walk past their bench anyway to go to the locker room. If you look back in the history of the league, there are so many teams and players that left the court without shaking hands. They just didn't have to walk past the other team to do so.
Fair enough, fair enough. And all of that is true. But Stephen A., I want to ask you a direct question, because we got to go back to what happened last night. Horace Grant said the Pistons were a bunch of straight up, and then a word I can't use, but it starts with the letter B. Was he right?
Well, I don't feel he was. I don't feel he was about that because, again, if Michael Jordan hadn't said what he had said the day before, I don't know if the Pistons would have done that. They didn't do it because they lost. They did it because they had been reigning two-time back-to-back champions, going for a third. Nobody had three-peated at the time, and Michael Jordan said what he said. Now, Michael Jordan had every right to say what he said because of what they had put him through and some of the tactics that they had employed. But I'm going to tell you the biggest reasons that I think that the Pistons are getting a bad rap about walking off the court. When you bring up the fact that the Boston Celtics walked off the court when Isiah Thomas and the Pistons had beaten them, remember Isiah Thomas highlights that Adrian Dantley was at the free throw line. He had stopped Kevin McHale, who was going to walk off, but he had talked to Isiah and nobody else. But Larry Bird walked off the court. Dennis Johnson walked off the court, along with others. And Larry Bird obviously was deified. The fact that he was white didn't hurt. And him walking off the court, it's one thing to not even be vilified by it. It's another thing entirely for Larry Bird to barely even be asked about walking off the court while the game was still going on. So we have to understand that what happened and the way that the Pistons were excoriated, it's because Michael Jordan was class personified. He was the greatest player in the world. He was ascending. And how dare the Pistons act this way? I'm saying the standard ain't consistent. If you're gonna vilify the Pistons for doing it, how come you never vilified Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics for doing it?
Jalen.
That's a legitimate question in my mind.
And also, just think about what the Pistons were trying to conquer in this day. You're overcoming two of the greatest franchises that the league has seen in the Lakers, led by Magic Johnson, and the Celtics, led by Larry Bird, and the Jordan-led Bulls.
Thank you for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.